So today's reading is taken from John chapter 15, verses 9 to 17. That's John chapter 15, verses 9 to 17. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Now remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know what his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends, for everything that I learned from my Father I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you so that you might go and bear fruit that will last, and so that whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give you. This is my command: love each other.
Today, I want you to wake up to the great love that God has for you and for others, to wake up and see how wonderful God is. That's more the type of gentle wake up we spoke about earlier, when somebody who loves you wants you to wake up and see the wonders of a new day. You may of course be saying, well, there's nothing wonderful going on around me at the moment, but nevertheless, today is an opportunity to wake up and see just how wonderful God is and how great his love for you is. Many of you will probably be feeling low, down, fed up. Of course, it may be that's not the case, and it's legitimate to be feeling okay at this time. But one of the things that God is wanting you to wake up to is the fact that his love doesn't depend on the circumstances around you. To help you see that, I want to tell a little story. Imagine one day you go to a child's party, and at that party, there before the child is a huge pile of expensively wrapped presents. Later on in the day, you go to another child's party, and at that party, on the table are just a few presents, and they're not wrapped in such glitzy, sparkling paper. Now, if I was to say to you, which child do you think was loved more? I don't think you would necessarily say, well, of course it was the child with more presents. I think you know enough about life to know that the child with heaps of presents may not necessarily be loved any more than the child with just a few presents. In fact, the child with a few presents may be more loved and feel more secure than the one who has lots. In the same way, God is wanting to say to you, look, just as you don't judge how much someone is loved by the amount of presents that they have before them, why do you judge how much I love you by the circumstances before you? By whether life is good or bad. Why do you make such shallow judgments? God is saying. And this morning, God's wanting you to wake up to having a new way of judging him and his love for you. Now, those who don't know Jesus often judge their sense of self-worth, their sense of well-being by how well life is going, by how well they're doing, perhaps at work, how healthy their family is, how well their children are at school. Many who don't yet know Jesus, who don't follow him, will drift forward with a vague sense of wanting to be happy in life, and happy will mean things generally going well. But Jesus, wants you to wake up in this time and to gain a different sense of perspective. Jesus, out of all people, deserved for his life to go well. He was a good man. He worked hard. He paid his taxes. He cared for his family. We're told that in his village, all spoke well of him. That's the village where he grew up. He'd have been known well. They knew that he was a good man. Yet while Jesus did have moments in his life that were full of joy, often in the company of others, his life was marked more by adversity, by difficulty, by sorrow. He was poor. He relied on gifts of food and money to keep going. And so moving on with Jesus' life story, I want to ask you, have you ever watched a film or read a book about someone whose life was or who was just about to be executed, maybe in Tudor times or the Middle Ages, where they seem to be chopping people's heads off quite regularly? And have you ever wondered what they would be thinking and feeling the night before their execution? Well, Jesus was brought to a place of execution, and you don't have to imagine how he felt the night before, because you're told, we've got recorded his conversation and his prayers. He felt so low, so down, so sorrowful. At one point he said, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Life seemed so dark to Jesus that he almost couldn't bear to carry on living. But it was no accident that Jesus was facing crucifixion. It was no accident that he was in emotional turmoil. It was no accident that he was abandoned by his followers in the middle of the night. God, who said of Jesus, "This is my own dear son, with whom I am well pleased," God had brought him here. God had brought him to the point where he was at the party with no presents. And how are you feeling? How are you? Do you feel God has lost control? Do you feel God has abandoned you? Do you feel that God doesn't seem to know what he's doing? Are you waking up in the middle of the night when everyone else seems to be snoring, left to your own thoughts and pain? Then know this, that God, who has determined the exact places where each one of us should live, has brought you to that point. And you'll be replying to me at this point, "Nathan, are you mad or are you just bad? Are you saying seriously that God has brought me to this point? He determined this is where I should be." No, no, no. This must be some freak accident. Soon God is going to restore normal service, to put things back as they should be. This current situation is an aberration. I've just got to get through this, you're saying. Then God can show me he loves me. Then everything can be as it should be, and we can be happy, and God can go back to show me that he loves me. But I am saying that I think God has brought you and me to this point, just as he brought Jesus to that point of suffering. I'm not saying that God loves bad things to happen to us. Nor am I saying that God makes bad things happen to us. God didn't make the soldiers execute Jesus. That was something they did. It wasn't God's idea for the mob to arrest Jesus. That was their decision. But God did allow those things to happen to Jesus. God did bring Jesus to the point where those things would happen. And God has brought you and God has brought me to this point. But here's the encouraging thought. If God has brought you and me to this point, then he must have a loving purpose. Now, what is that purpose, you're asking? Well, to understand what God's purpose is for you at this point, to understand what his love is for you at this point, you need to appreciate what God's purpose was for Jesus, how God's love was demonstrated in and through Jesus at the point of his crucifixion. Let's have a look at that now. At Christ's crucifixion, God was showing the strength of his love. God was showing that his love is stronger than death. Jesus faced death, yet he carried on with God's purposes because he loved his Father and he loved you. Death wouldn't prevent him acting out of love for his Father or for you. His love was stronger than death. And as well as the strength of God's love, God was showing the power of his love in Jesus. Jesus' love was a love that overcame death, that brought life from death through the resurrection. It was a love that brought hope from hopelessness, light in darkness, forgiveness in bitterness and rancor, eternity in triumph where there was finality and gloom. So what does God want you to wake up to? What aspect of his love for you does God gently and lovingly want you to wake up to? Well, of course, that's going to be different for each one of you. The wonderful thing is you are so beautifully and wonderfully made that God's purposes will be slightly different for each one of you. And we could just explore a few general areas where he may be doing something, and then you can think, well, how exactly is it that God is trying to help me grasp how deep and wide and long his love is? Of course, you may say to me, Nathan, you do not know what it is like for me at the moment. You don't know how hard it is for me to homeschool, to work, to be away from my family, to have gloomy days, to be stuck in my house all day. You've got no idea. I used to be able to manage my life and everything, and now I can't. Well, I don't know what it is like to be you. But when you say, I used to be able to manage my life and now I can't, I do know that you're sort of at the edge of your resources. And one of the ways that God may be wanting you to experience his love in a new way is through receiving help from him. You see, you used to be able to do everything and manage everything, family, work, life in general. And now you can't. And that's an unusual place for you to be. Previously, you didn't need God's help. But now you do. And when we receive help, we feel loved. I remember once at a very difficult time in my career as a head teacher, I was sitting in a library, I had a period to go and do some study. And it was a very difficult day for me. And the librarian brought me a cup of tea and some biscuits. I felt so loved. It was totally unsolicited. I hadn't said anything or mentioned anything. Such a generous act. And you know, God may be wanting you to feel loved because now you're willing to be helped. Of course, you always needed help, but now you're willing. And this is a time for you to sense God's love as he helps you in so many different ways. God says, do not be afraid, for I am with you. Do not despair, for I am your God. It might be you're saying, God can't help me. I've tried to change. I can't change. I get cross. And then I get cross with myself for getting cross. And then I get cross with those people I've got cross with, that they're cross with me because they don't understand why I'm cross. And, or you might be completely the opposite. You may be, like Sallyann described herself as earlier, you may go into yourself. You may push people away and you're in pain and they're in pain because they can see you're in pain, but they can't help. And you may have tried to change habits. You may have even thought that you'd changed, and then this current situation has perhaps shown you how shallow that change was. But what God's wanting to do is go deeper. God doesn't just change habits. He loves to change character. He loves you. He wants to renew you deep inside. I am a new creation, it says in the Bible. And God wants to change your character, which shapes your habits. Like, I'm no psychologist and no psychiatrist, but it may be if you're angry, he's wanting to help you to know how deeply loved you are, so that you don't feel the need to overcome people with your emotions so that they hear you, but you're able to gradually begin to express what you're feeling inside and communicate those genuine thoughts and feelings to others in a way that's helpful to you or to them. It may be that if you're the type of person who pushes others away, God's wanting you to feel so securely loved that you can actually begin to open up and receive their love and feel loved. You know, in that passage Sallyann wrote about, Jesus said, I chose you and appointed you to go and bear fruit. And the type of fruit Jesus is talking about is love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, kindness, humility, and self-control. Deep change from within. And that change promotes peace within you and peace within others. Of course, you may be feeling desperately lonely or bored or both. You've run out, you've watched every TV program, you've done all your crosswords, you've done all your jigsaws. And it may be that God's saying, look, I'd love you and I to chat. I'd love you to talk to me. I'd love you to enjoy me, to see just who I am. And now perhaps everything, the glitter of everything else has gone. Why don't you take the time to talk to Jesus? It would have been good to have talked to him when everything was glittery as well, but you could develop the habit now, and then as you come out of lockdown, you'll still be talking to him and realizing just how wonderful he is and how much he loves you. Take time to read his Bible in a way you've never done before. It could be that if you're bored, he's trying to help you do things differently or new. See, I'm doing a new thing, says Jesus. Maybe it's a new project, new opportunity, new skill or thing to learn. Who knows? Or it may be that you're confronting fear. I'm sure Jesus confronted fear, but he wasn't overcome with fear, but he certainly felt fear all around him at that Garden of Gethsemane, that the night before his execution. You may be very afraid. You may be worried about your own health or the health of others. You may be worried about your children not being educated in the kind of normal social environment. Or if you've got very young children and having not many opportunities to socialize, you might be worried about your teenage children, about their exams and university opportunities. You may be worried about your job and your job security. And the night before Jesus' execution, there seemed to be a wall before him. Maybe your feeling is, the options are limited. But Jesus went through the wall. Jesus trusted in God and moved in his spirit. And God is wanting to say, look, when the circumstances look wall-like, when it's dark, when you're hemmed in, please will you trust me? I love you. Look, look how I brought my son back to life. Look, I want to do something. I want you to trust me. He says, don't be afraid. Behold, I've overcome the world, says Jesus. At this point, I wonder if I can share my own story that I hope might be helpful. Sallyann was sharing earlier about that very difficult time we went through. And it was a very dark time, that car accident she spoke about. I actually thought that for a moment, genuinely, I thought I died. And there are other things happening as well. And very traumatic. And during that period, I had, through all this pain and difficulty, I had this growing sense of God's deep love for me. It was a bit like a seam of gold in a deep, dark mine, but that gold was shining brightly. Or it was like the purr of a very good car engine under the bonnet. I can't imagine anyone wanting those experiences, and I wouldn't want to go through them again. But I wouldn't want to swap what God forged in me at that time. It was a time of deep pain. And part of that sense of the depth of God's love, which resonates even now within me, came from the kind words people said to us, gifts of food, some friends of mine just asking me out for a game of squash because they just knew I needed to do something with them. They weren't very clever in what they said. They knew they didn't know what to say, and I didn't really want them to say anything either. I didn't want to talk about anything, but they did what they could, which was to play squash, and that's what I wanted to do. And I know through the countless prayers of other people that God responded. I could even feel people praying for me, as it were. And so in that dark time, God forged in me a sense of the depth of his love. If that story is helpful for you, well, that's good. But if it doesn't help you in any way, then please just don't worry at all. But to receive God's love, you have to choose to do so. If you're a trained counsellor, a pastor, a psychotherapist, or a teacher, you'll know that unless your client, your patient, wants to change, wants to be helped, that there is no point going through any course of treatment or coaching with them. In the same way, unless you choose to allow Jesus to help you, there's very little God can do. Jesus in the garden chose to opt in to God, to be open to all God's purposes for his life. He felt terrible. The circumstances were dark. And he said, Father, take this cup of suffering from me if you are willing. But not my will be done, but your will be done. At this moment, God is giving you a choice. You're in a difficult scenario. There's no opt-out here. But you can choose to be like those who don't know God, who see this as a wasted time, a time to pass by as quickly as possible until the good times roll again. You can choose to be angry with God, to turn away from him. Or you can choose to allow God to reveal more of his love for you. You can choose to allow God to redeem this time, as it were, to use this time in a very special way. And as you choose to move into God's purposes, so you choose to allow Jesus to do those things that you cannot do. Jesus overcame death with life because he knew you couldn't do that. Jesus overcame fear because he knew that you couldn't do that. Jesus allowed honor God completely because he knew that you couldn't do that. Only Jesus brings the deep change within you, demonstrated through him rising from the dead. And he did that because he loves you as the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. And when you opt into God's purposes, you allow Jesus to do all those things that you cannot do. You allow him to carry the burden that you cannot carry. Come unto me, all you who are heavy laden, says Jesus, and I will give you rest. I want now to draw your attention to one final thing. Sallyann read in that passage Jesus' words, remain in my love. If you obey my commands, you will remain in my love. Now it looks like Jesus is saying, if you read it quickly without, but not carefully, is if you obey my commands, I'll love you. But I don't think he's saying that at all. What I think he's saying is, if you love me, you'll follow me. And if you follow me, you'll want to keep loving others. What are the two commands that God's given? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength, and love your neighbour as you love yourself. So as you sense God's love, you draw close to him, you'll want to love others. And as you love others, you'll sense more of God's love. It's a sort of upward circle. I wonder if I can demonstrate just from my own life. So I've felt God encouraging me to be more gentle in my approach to others. So rather than overwhelming everybody with my wonderful opinions, to just take time to listen a bit more to what they're saying without interrupting, instead of pushing people for perfection in what they do, to just enjoy and allow them to have a go and appreciate their efforts, particularly if it's something they've never done before. And as I've done that, I've woken up to God's love for me. So as I'm enjoying listening to other people, I'm thinking, wow, God enjoys listening to me. And as I appreciate just the effort and people having a go, I think, oh, God really appreciates me having a go, even if I don't get it right all the time. Oh, that's so encouraging. So as I sense God's love and I'm trying to love others, and many of you will be loving far better than I do. So I also sense more of God's love for me. So I kind of remain in God's love, as it were. And as the more I remain in God's love, the more I'm loving others. And I think that's perhaps maybe a little bit of what Jesus is saying there. And we can demonstrate God's love to others in all sorts of ways, can't we? Just as a bit of a fun example, Theo, our son, and his cousin just sensed our grandparents maybe running out of things to do. You know, they can't see so many people. They've done all their things. And so he and his cousin designed a degree course for the grandparents. They have to do such things as a photo shoot. They've got to take nice photos of each other. I'm reading now from the degree course, of each other in the garden. They've got to create a pasta dish with the most outrageous topping or filler. They've got to serve each other baked beans and judge the other's meal. They've got to do a Zoom presentation on someone who's had a big impact. They've got to learn a new card game. They've got to cook one of the following: pesto pasta, fajitas, curry, and homemade pizza. So it's kind of fun. And they've set them a deadline. Now, not that I want to be one to call out my mum and dad on the internet, but Mum, Dad, I think you're looking at needing an extension, aren't you? You know what you've got to do this afternoon. So all sorts of things that we can do. We might be able to encourage one another in activities. So, for example, I know in the running club in normal times, when it's wet and cold, the fact if I've arranged to run with someone else, I know I've got to go even if I don't feel like it. Now, you may not feel you can go out with someone, but you could agree with someone that you're both going to do a bit of exercise today. You're both going to go for a walk or a run or a cycle ride or whatever it is, and you're going to post a picture or text each other when you've done that, and that might encourage you to both do something. So there's all sorts of things that you can do. Of course, some of you will be in a place where all you can do is receive at the moment, and all God is calling you to do right now is to receive his love, maybe directly, maybe through others. But of course, many of us will be in a place where even we can do little things to reach out to others, to show God's love. And so many of you are doing that so generously. Thank you. Let's just keep on encouraging one another. So God is lovingly saying, wake up to the love I have for you. It's greater than you could ever know. And this is a wonderful opportunity, not wonderful in the sense that isn't it great and we're all happy, but it's a unique opportunity to experience God's love in a way that may not be possible in other circumstances. Can I encourage you to be open, to choose to be open to God's purposes, to his deep love for you, and to grasp how wide and deep and high and long that love is. And as you receive and experience his love, to show love to others.